The first time I understood that my family would always choose someone else over me was not at Christmas or at a birthday or even at my wedding. It was on a cold January evening, standing in the back hallway of a country club in Connecticut, listening to my own name spoken like a mistake. "You can't seriously expect her to be part of this," my sister said, her voice sharp, confident, unbothered. "This is supposed to be a celebration." My mother didn't argue. She sighed instead, the sound she always made when she wanted to appear torn while already having decided. "We'll seat her near the kitchen. She won't mind." I did mind, but I stayed quiet because staying quiet was what I had learned to do best. My name is Claire Holden. I was 31 years old that night. Old enough to know better. Old enough to walk away. Old enough to understand that silence, when repeated for decades, becomes a kind of consent. That night was supposed to be about my brother's engagement party. My younger brother, Daniel, the golden son, the one who could do no wrong, the one whose mistakes were framed as growing pains while mine were treated like character flaws. I had flown in from Chicago that morning, taking unpaid time off from the consulting firm where I worked. I arrived with a carefully wrapped gift, a practiced smile, and the quiet hope that maybe this time things would be different. They never were. The club was decorated in winter whites and silver. Chandeliers glowed overhead. Champagne flutes clinked. People laughed easily, comfortably. My sister Marissa moved through the room like she owned it. She always did. Perfect hair, perfect posture, perfect timing. She had married well, married rich, married into the kind of family my parents admired openly. I stood near the coat check, clutching my purse, watching the family cluster around Daniel and his fiancée. They looked like a magazine spread. I looked like an afterthought. When my mother finally noticed me, she smiled the way you smile at someone you forgot to invite but who showed up anyway. "Oh, Claire, you made it." I had made it, like I always did, quietly, without complaint, without expectation. The evening unfolded exactly as it always did. Conversations stopped when I joined them. Jokes resumed when I left. When the photographer arrived, I was asked to step aside. "Just immediate family," Marissa said sweetly, as if I wasn't standing right there. Immediate family. I learned early that the definition was flexible. At dinner, I was placed at a table with distant cousins and an elderly couple who thought I worked in human resources because that sounds like something you'd be good at. I smiled and nodded and ate my chicken while my family toasted at the head table. Then came the speeches. My father stood first, glass raised. He spoke about legacy, about tradition, about how proud he was of Daniel for carrying the family name forward. Then Marissa took the microphone. She laughed lightly. "I think we all know Daniel has always been the responsible one, the one we could count on, not like some people." A pause, a glance in my direction. "But tonight proves that good things come to those who do things the right way." Laughter rippled through the room, polite, complicit. My face burned. I stared down at my plate, the words sinking in deeper than they should have. I thought of Thanksgiving dinners where my ideas were dismissed, birthdays forgotten, promotions downplayed. I thought of the way my parents spoke about me when they thought I wasn't listening. Too sensitive, too independent, too much. I thought of the will. I hadn't known about it then. Not fully. Just whispers. Hints. A passing comment from my grandmother before she died. "Make sure you protect yourself, Claire. They don't see you the way I do." I had brushed it off. Because believing her meant admitting something painful. That love in our family was conditional. That fairness was a performance. That night, as applause filled the room, I excused myself and walked into the hallway. My heels clicked sharply against the marble floor. My hands were shaking. I leaned against the wall and breathed. That was when I heard them. My mother, my father, Marissa, Daniel. "They don't need to know yet," my father said. "There's no reason to complicate things." "And Claire," my mother asked. A pause. "She's not part of it," Marissa said. "She never really was." The words landed with the clarity that hurt more than anger, more than sadness. I wasn't part of it. Something inside me shifted then. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet, irreversible click. I realized that night that if I stayed silent, I would disappear entirely. That if I kept hoping for fairness, I would be waiting forever. I went back into the room. I smiled. I congratulated my brother. I hugged my mother. I thanked my sister for the seating arrangement. And I made a decision. I would stop asking to belong. I would start paying attention. Because if there was one thing my family had taught me well, it was this: people who underestimate you never see the knife coming. I flew back to Chicago the morning after the engagement party with a headache that had nothing to do with champagne. The cabin lights hummed softly as the plane lifted off, and I stared out the window watching Connecticut shrink into a patchwork of gray and white. I'd done this flight dozens of times before, always leaving with the same tightness in my chest, always telling myself it would hurt less next time. It never did, but something had changed. I could feel it in the way my thoughts no longer raced to justify them. I wasn't asking myself what I'd done wrong or how I could have handled things better. Instead, a colder question repeated itself, steady and uncomfortable. What exactly were they hiding? My grandmother, Eleanor Holden, had died when I was 23. She'd been sharp until the end, the only person in my family who looked me in the eye when I spoke. In her final months, she'd asked me strange questions: whether I was saving money, whether I trusted my parents with paperwork, whether I knew where important documents were kept. I'd laughed it off back then. I was young, tired, still convinced that families, even flawed ones, ultimately meant well. Now sitting 30,000 feet above the Midwest, I replayed her words with a different lens. Make sure you protect yourself. When I got home, my apartment felt unusually quiet. No background noise of judgment. No subtle reminders that I took up too much or too little space. I kicked off my shoes, set my suitcase by the door, and stood there for a long moment listening to my own breathing. That was when my phone buzzed. A text from Marissa. "You left early. Mom was worried you were upset." I stared at the screen, a humorless smile tugging at my mouth. Worried wasn't the word. Managing was. Containing. Making sure I didn't become inconvenient. I typed back a neutral response. Just tired. Busy week ahead. Busy. That part was true. Over the next few days, I did what I always did best. I worked. Long hours. Precise reports. Client calls that stretched late into the evening. Consulting had taught me how to observe systems without becoming emotionally entangled in them. It had taught me how power actually moved. Quietly. Through access, through information. And that was when the connections started forming. At a team dinner, one of my colleagues mentioned estate planning, casually. Her parents had updated their will, and she was irritated by the paperwork involved. I asked a few questions, like curious, as if I were only half listening. Later that night, I pulled up public records. Not because I expected to find anything, but because once you start looking, it's hard to stop. The Holden Family Trust had been established decades ago. That much I knew. What I hadn't known was how many amendments it had gone through, how many conditions were attached, how often my parents' names appeared as managers rather than beneficiaries. Managers, not owners. That distinction sat heavy in my chest. I requested a copy of the trust documents through proper channels, citing my name, my relation, my right to review. I expected delays, resistance. What I didn't expect was how quickly a clerk responded, her tone careful, almost sympathetic. "There are some restrictions," she said over the phone, "but you may be entitled to more information than you realize." Entitled, that word echoed. While I waited, memories sharpened with uncomfortable clarity. My college fund that had mysteriously run out. Marissa's private tutors. Daniel's business loan quietly forgiven by my parents. The way my mother once told me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "You're just better at handling things on your own." I'd worn that sentence like a badge of honor for years. Now I saw it for what it was, a justification. The documents arrived a week later in a thick envelope that felt heavier than paper should. I spread them across my dining table, the afternoon light catching on the legal language, the signatures, the dates. There it was, a clause I'd never seen before, a contingency, clear, deliberate. The trust was designed to bypass my parents under specific conditions. Conditions tied to fairness, to equal treatment, to documented favoritism. My breath caught as I read my name. Not as an afterthought, not buried, explicit. Claire Holden was listed as a contingent beneficiary if those conditions were violated. I sat back in my chair, heart pounding, the room suddenly too small. They hadn't just underestimated me. They had worked around me, carefully, strategically, counting on my silence, counting on my reluctance to question, counting on the version of me they had trained. I thought of that night at the club, of Marissa's laugh, of my father's pause, of my mother's sigh. "She's not part of it." They were wrong. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I wouldn't confront them, not yet. I wouldn't accuse or demand or beg. I would gather facts. Because systems don't collapse from emotion, they collapse from exposure. As the city lights flickered on outside my window, I raised my glass slightly, not in celebration but in acknowledgement. For the first time, I understood the rules of the game I'd been playing my entire life. And I was done losing without knowing why. I did not tell anyone what I'd found, not my friends, not my colleagues, not even myself out loud. I moved through the next week like a woman carrying contraband in her coat, careful alert, pretending nothing had changed while everything had. At work, I listened more than I spoke. I noticed who interrupted whom in meetings, who took credit, who softened their tone when power entered the room. Consulting had trained me for this moment without my knowing it. Patterns reveal themselves when you stop asking to be liked. I made an appointment with an attorney I'd never met, recommended by a colleague who owed me a favor. Her name was Ruth Calder. She specialized in trust disputes and family business litigation, the kind of lawyer who didn't advertise on billboards and didn't waste time reassuring clients. Her office was in an older building near the river, all dark wood and clean lines. No inspirational quotes on the wall, no smiling stock photos, just framed degrees and a single window overlooking gray water. She shook my hand once firmly, then gestured for me to sit. "Tell me what you know," she said. I told her everything: the engagement party, the hallway conversation, the documents, my grandmother's comments. I watched her face carefully as I spoke. It didn't change, not once. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and steepled her fingers. "You understand," she said, "that what you're describing isn't favoritism. It's breach of duty." The word landed hard. "Your parents were not owners," she continued. "They were stewards, managers. If they violated the conditions of the trust intentionally or through neglect, they exposed themselves legally." I swallowed, and my siblings. She paused. "Beneficiaries of the breach. Possibly co-conspirators depending on what they knew and when." My pulse quickened, not from fear, from recognition. Ruth opened a folder and slid a legal pad toward me. "There are 3 paths," she said. 1. You confront them privately and negotiate. 2. You file a formal petition to compel an accounting. 3. You do nothing and walk away. I didn't hesitate. The second one. Her mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Almost." "Good," she said. "Then you need to understand something. This will not be quick, and it will not be quiet." "I don't need quiet," I replied. "I need the truth." She nodded. "Then we start by asking questions they cannot answer without lying." The petition went out the following week. Formal, precise, unforgiving. It requested a full accounting of trust management over the past 2 decades. Every distribution, every transfer, every decision justified in writing. My phone rang less than an hour after it was delivered. My mother. I let it ring. Then my father. Then Marissa. I turned the phone face down and went for a walk along the river, the cold air sharp against my cheeks. People passed me wrapped in coats and scarves, living lives that had nothing to do with mine. I felt strangely grounded among them. When I returned home, there was a voicemail waiting. "Claire," my mother said, her voice brittle, "we need to talk immediately." I deleted it. The next call came from Daniel. That one I answered. "What are you doing?" he asked, no greeting, no warmth. "I'm asking questions," I said. "You're blowing this up," he snapped. "You don't understand how complicated things are." I laughed softly. "I understand exactly how complicated they made it." There was a pause. Then quieter, Marissa says, "You're trying to take something that isn't yours." I closed my eyes. "She's wrong." "You always do this," he continued. "You always assume the worst." "No," I said. "I finally stopped assuming the best." He hung up. Over the next few weeks, documents began to arrive. Boxes of them. Financial statements, correspondence, amendments signed without proper oversight, transfers labeled as loans that were never repaid, tuition payments, business investments. Patterns emerged quickly. Marissa's graduate program, funded. Daniel's failed startup, absorbed. My student loans, untouched. Ruth called me one evening, her voice steady. "They use the trust as a private wallet," she said, "and they justified it by telling themselves you didn't need help." I sat on the edge of my bed, the room spinning slightly. "What happens now?" "Now," she replied, "we depose them." The depositions were scheduled for early spring. Neutral offices, court reporters, Oaths administered with clinical precision. My mother went first. She cried. She spoke about stress, about doing her best, about how hard it was to raise 3 children with different needs. Ruth let her talk. Then she asked one question. Did Claire Holden ever consent to the use of trust funds designated for her education being redirected to her siblings? Silence. No, my mother whispered. And were you aware, Ruth continued, that such redirection violated the express conditions of the trust? My mother looked up, eyes wide. We thought it would be fine. Thought. Daniel's deposition was shorter. He claimed ignorance, claimed he trusted our parents, claimed he assumed everything was fair. Marissa's was the longest. She was sharp, defensive, controlled, until Ruth placed a single email on the table. An email from Marissa to my mother dated years earlier. She's strong, she'll be fine without it. Use it for Daniel, he needs it more. Marissa stared at the paper, her composure cracked. I didn't think she'd ever know, she said. That sentence echoed in my head for days. She didn't think I'd ever know. By the time the depositions ended, the truth was no longer theoretical. It was documented, time-stamped, signed. Ruth called me into her office again, the river dark outside the window. You're entitled to restitution, she said. And more than that, you're entitled to control. I nodded slowly. What happens to them? She met my eyes. That depends on what you ask for. I thought of the hallway at the country club, of my name spoken like a mistake, of the years I'd spent shrinking to fit a space never meant for me. I don't want revenge, I said carefully. I want balance. Ruth considered that. Sometimes she said those are the same thing. As I left her office that night, my phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number. You think you're so smart. You're tearing this family apart. I stared at the screen, then typed back a single sentence. No, I'm just telling the truth. And for the first time, I understood that truth once spoken does not belong to anyone anymore. The weeks after the depositions felt like standing in the eye of a storm. Everything looked calm on the surface, but I could feel the pressure building in every direction. My parents stopped calling. Daniel stopped texting. Marissa, for once, said nothing at all. Silence can be strategic. I knew that better than anyone. At work, I kept my head down. My projects were delivered early. My tone stayed neutral. I did not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. If anything, I felt sharper than ever. There is a peculiar clarity that comes when the truth has already been spoken, and all that remains is consequence. Ruth warned me not to underestimate what came next. Families don't fall apart quietly, she said during one of our check-ins. They rewrite the narrative first. She was right. The first version of the new story reached me through a mutual acquaintance, someone I'd known since high school. We met for coffee, and within minutes I could tell she was uncomfortable. She kept stirring her drink long after the sugar had dissolved. I ran into your mom, she said carefully. She seems worried. I waited. She said you've been under a lot of pressure lately, that work has been getting to you, that you're confused about some things. I smiled faintly, confused. She didn't mean it badly, the woman added quickly, just that maybe you're misinterpreting the past. There it was, the soft erasure, the gentle suggestion that I was emotional, mistaken, unstable. They had used that tactic my entire life. The difference now was that I could see it clearly laid out like a script I'd already memorized. I appreciate you telling me, I said, and I meant it. Information is always useful, even when it's ugly. Within days, the whispers grew louder. An aunt emailed me a link to an article about forgiveness. An uncle left a voicemail warning me that legal battles only hurt everyone involved. A cousin suggested mediation as if the problem were hurt feelings rather than documented misconduct. No one asked me what had actually happened. They didn't need to. The family had already decided. It was easier to believe I'd changed than to accept they'd benefited from my silence. Ruth called me one evening, her voice steady but alert. They've retained separate counsel, she said. Your parents and Marissa. Daniel hasn't. That figures, I replied. They're preparing a response, she continued. They'll argue intent, that they believed they were acting in the best interest of the family. The family, I repeated, never me. She paused. There's something else. I held my breath. They're floating the idea of reconciliation, Ruth said. Informal, off the record. A meeting. They want to see if you'll soften. I closed my eyes. For a split second, the old reflex flared. The instinct to smooth things over, to make it easier, to be reasonable so no one accused me of being difficult. Then it passed. Tell them no, I said. Are you sure, Ruth asked? Yes, I replied. If they want resolution, they can find it in the truth. The next escalation came faster than I expected. One morning, as I was getting ready for work, my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Claire," my father said. His voice sounded older than it should have. "We need to talk." "I'm working," I replied calmly. "This can't wait," he said. "Your mother's beside herself." I leaned against the counter, grounding myself. "I'm sure she is." "You don't understand what you're doing," he continued. "You're damaging things that can't be repaired." I thought of my student loan statements, of Marissa's email, of the trust documents spread across my table. Some things were damaged long before I noticed, I said. He exhaled sharply. "We did our best." "No," I replied. "You did what was convenient." There was a long silence. Then quieter. "What do you want?" The question startled me, not because I didn't have an answer, but because no one had ever asked it sincerely before. "I want accountability," I said, "and I want it documented." "That will destroy us," he said. I swallowed. "You already made those choices." After I hung up, my hands shook, not with doubt, with release. A week later, Ruth sent me a draft of the filing. It was thorough, relentless, every misallocation itemized, every violation cross-referenced. Reading it felt like watching my life translated into numbers and footnotes. Cold, precise, undeniable. "This is the point of no return," Ruth said when we reviewed it together. I nodded. "I passed that point a long time ago." The filing went through on a Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, my inbox was full of messages I didn't open. I didn't need to read them to know their contents. Fear, anger, appeals to family loyalty that had never flowed in my direction. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the floor of my living room back against the couch. The city lights flickered outside the window. I felt tired but not broken. For the first time, I allowed myself to grieve not just what I'd lost, but what I'd never been given. The safety of fairness, the comfort of being considered. Tears came slow and quiet. I let them. This wasn't weakness, it was acknowledgement. When they passed, something solid remained. Resolve. They had spent years crafting a story where I was the problem, where my independence excused their neglect, where my silence was mistaken for consent. Now that story was collapsing under the weight of evidence. And I knew with a calm certainty that surprised me that the hardest part was still ahead. Because once the truth is undeniable, people stop pretending they don't see it. They start fighting to survive it. The offer arrived on a Monday morning disguised as peace. Ruth forwarded me the email with no commentary. She didn't need to. I could read tone the way some people read weather. The subject line alone told me everything. Proposed resolution. I opened it slowly, coffee cooling on my desk, my stomach already tight. My parents' attorney wrote in careful conciliatory language. He acknowledged administrative errors. He expressed regret for any unintended harm. He emphasized the family's desire to avoid prolonged conflict. Then came the number. A settlement amount large enough to make most people stop asking questions. Large enough to cover my student loans, buy a comfortable home, and still leave room to breathe. Large enough to make walking away tempting, but not large enough to be fair. More importantly, it came with conditions. A non-disclosure agreement. No further legal action. No public filings. No admission of wrongdoing. The trust would be restructured internally under continued family management. In other words, they wanted to pay me to disappear quietly the way I always had. I leaned back in my chair, eyes closed, listening to the faint hum of the office around me. Phones ringing, printers whirring. Ordinary life continuing while mine balanced on a familiar edge. For a moment, I pictured the version of myself from years ago. The one who would have accepted. The one who would have told herself that money was money, that peace mattered more than principle, that being reasonable was a virtue, even when it came at a cost. That woman had survived by making herself smaller. I wasn't her anymore. I called Ruth. "They want silence," I said. "They always do," she replied. "What happens if I refuse?" She didn't hesitate. "They escalate or they fold." I stared at the city skyline through my window. "And if they escalate, then we keep going," she said calmly, "because they're already exposed." I thanked her and hung up. That afternoon, my mother showed up at my apartment unannounced. The concierge called first, his voice uncertain. "There's a woman here asking for you. Says she's your mother." My chest tightened, but my voice stayed steady. "Send her up." I don't know why I agreed to see her. Curiosity, maybe? Or the part of me that wanted to look this moment in the face fully awake. She stood stiffly in my living room coat, still on purse clutched to her chest like armor. She looked smaller than I remembered, older. The confidence she'd worn for decades had thinned. "You look tired," she said, glancing around as if cataloging my life. "So do you," I replied. She sat without being invited. I remained standing. "We didn't raise you to be like this," she said, skipping pleasantries entirely. I almost laughed. "You didn't raise me to ask questions. You're being vindictive," she said. "This isn't who you are." I crossed my arms. "Who am I then?" She opened her mouth, closed it. Tried again. "You were always independent. Strong. You didn't need as much." There it was, the justification she'd rehearsed for years. "I needed fairness," I said quietly. "You just decided I could live without it." Her eyes flashed. "You think Marissa didn't need help? You think Daniel would have survived without support?" I met her gaze. "You didn't help them, you favored them." She stood abruptly, pacing now. "We're offering you a solution, money, closure." "Silence," I corrected. She stopped. "What more do you want?" The question echoed my father's words weeks earlier. This time I didn't hesitate. "I want the truth on record," I said, "and I want the trust removed from your control." Her face drained of color. "You're tearing this family apart." "No," I replied. "I'm refusing to hold it together with my own ribs." She stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. Then her expression hardened. "If you go through with this," she said, "don't expect to be welcome anymore." The threat landed flat. Too late, too empty. "I already wasn't," I said. She left without another word. That night, the pressure intensified. Texts from relatives, calls from unknown numbers, carefully worded messages about forgiveness and unity. Not one apology, not one acknowledgement of harm. Daniel called me late, his voice low. "They're scared," he said. "You don't understand how bad this could get." I closed my eyes. "I understand perfectly." "They're talking about selling assets," he continued. "About restructuring everything." "Good," I replied. "That's what accountability looks like." He sighed. "You always had to push." I felt something cold and clear settle in my chest. "No," I said. I finally stopped absorbing. The next morning, Ruth and I drafted our response. It was brief. "We decline the proposed settlement. We will proceed with formal action. No justification, no emotion, just refusal." The reply went out before noon. By evening, the tone shifted. Threats replaced appeals. Accusations replaced concern. They accused me of greed, of resentment, of trying to punish them for imagined slights. I read each message once, then archived it. Because beneath the noise, something else was happening. The court had scheduled a preliminary hearing. A date, a time, a public record. The story they'd controlled for decades was about to be told without their editing. As I sat alone that night, city lights reflecting off the glass, I felt a strange calm. The kind that comes not from certainty of outcome, but certainty of self. They had tried to buy my silence because they knew how dangerous my voice could be. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to use it. What they didn't realize yet was this. The moment you refuse to be bought is the moment you stop being owned. And I had never felt more free. The courthouse smelled like old paper and disinfectant. A scent that always makes everything feel heavier than it is. I arrived early, standing on the steps for a moment longer than necessary, letting the cold air steady my breathing. Inside, people moved with purpose, folders tucked under arms, heels clicking against stone. Everyone looked like they belonged there. For years, I had been told I didn't belong anywhere that mattered. That morning, I knew better. Ruth met me just inside the security checkpoint. She wore the same charcoal suit she always did, for court hair pulled back, tight, expression unreadable. She nodded once, the smallest reassurance. "They're already here," she said. I didn't ask who, I knew. The courtroom itself was smaller than I expected. No drama, no grand gestures. Just benches, a judge's seat, and the quiet hum of anticipation. My parents sat together on one side, stiff and pale. My mother's hands were clasped so tightly, her knuckles had gone white. My father stared straight ahead, jaw locked. Marissa sat a few rows behind them alone. She didn't look at me. Daniel wasn't there. That absence said more than his presence ever could. When the judge entered the room, rose as one. The sound of bodies shifting echoed sharply, then settled into silence. My heart pounded, but my mind felt clear, almost detached, as if I were observing rather than participating. This was not about emotion anymore. It was about record. Ruth spoke first. Calm, precise. She outlined the trust, its purpose, its conditions. She spoke about fiduciary duty, about documented transfers, about patterns that could not be explained away as mistakes. When she finished, she sat down without flourish. My parents' attorney stood next. He was polished, confident, practiced. He spoke of family complexity, of intent, of difficult decisions made in good faith. He did not mention my name once. The judge listened without expression, fingers steepled, eyes sharp. When the attorney finished, she leaned forward slightly. Intent does not override obligation, she said, and good faith does not excuse documented breach. The words hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. My mother's breath hitched. The judge continued, "This court orders a full accounting. An independent trustee will be appointed pending review." I felt it then, not triumph, not relief. Validation. Control was being removed from their hands. The judge set dates, deadlines, consequences for non-compliance. Everything Ruth had prepared for unfolded exactly as it should have. As the hearing adjourned, people stood gathered, papers whispered to one another. My parents remained seated for a moment too long, as if standing would require an effort they hadn't prepared for. Outside the courtroom, my mother finally approached me. Her eyes were red, her posture brittle. "You didn't have to do this," she said. I met her gaze steadily. "Yes," I replied, "I did." "This will ruin us," she whispered. I tilted my head slightly. "You ruined yourselves when you decided fairness was optional." Her mouth opened, then closed. For once, she had nothing to say. Marissa brushed past us without a word, heels striking the floor, hard anger radiating off her in waves. I watched her go, surprised by how little I felt. Ruth touched my arm lightly. "You handled that well." "I didn't handle it," I said. "I let it happen." That afternoon, my phone exploded. Messages from relatives who had ignored me for years. Concerned texts, thinly veiled warnings. Some were angry. Some were pleading. A few were suddenly curious about my side of the story. I answered none of them, because the story was no longer mine to explain. It was documented, filed, moving forward with or without their approval. 2 days later, Daniel finally called. "I should have been there," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. Silence stretched between us. "They're furious," he continued. "At you, at me, at everyone." I almost laughed. Fury doesn't undo facts. "You're changing everything," he said. "No," I corrected. "I'm stopping it from staying the same." He sighed. "Marissa says you're enjoying this." I felt a flicker of something sharp and honest. "I'm enjoying not lying anymore." He didn't respond. That night alone in my apartment, I replayed the day in my mind. The judge's words. The way my mother's certainty had finally cracked. The absence of Daniel's support when it mattered. I thought about my grandmother again. About her quiet questions. Her warning. She had known. She had trusted me to do something with that knowledge, even if I didn't realize it at the time. The next phase would be worse. I knew that. Independent reviews meant exposure. Exposure meant fallout. Assets frozen, stories leaking, reputations questioned. Families like mine survive on the illusion of respectability. Once that illusion fractures, the damage spreads quickly. I stood at my window watching the city lights flicker below and felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. Not because it was over, but because I was no longer pretending it wasn't happening. They had believed I would back down once things became public. That embarrassment would keep me compliant. That loyalty would override self-respect. They had mistaken my patience for weakness. What they were about to learn was this. I was not afraid of the truth being seen. I was afraid of never telling it. And now that it was out, there was no going back. Not for them, not for me. The next hearing was already on the calendar. And this time, the entire structure they had built their power on would be under scrutiny. That was the moment I understood. This was no longer about inheritance. It was about consequence. And consequences, once set in motion, do not ask permission. Once the independent trustee was appointed, everything moved faster than my family could manage. That was the irony. For years, they had controlled the narrative by slowing things down, by burying decisions in paperwork and polite silence. Now that control was gone. The truth surfaced the way it always does when no one is holding it underwater anymore. The trustee, a man named Harold Whitman, was efficient and unimpressed by emotion. He didn't care about family dynamics or long histories. He cared about numbers, signatures, dates, and authority. The kind of man my parents had always underestimated because he didn't look threatening. Ruth called me the day after his first review began. "He's found discrepancies already," she said. "More than we expected." I closed my eyes, a familiar mix of dread and resolve tightening my chest. "How bad?" She exhaled slowly. "Worse for them, better for you." The initial findings were enough to trigger a deeper audit. Accounts that should have been dormant were active. Funds earmarked for future beneficiaries had been accessed repeatedly. Not just for tuition or business ventures, but for things that were harder to justify. renovations, vacations. A second property that had never been disclosed. The family story was unraveling thread by thread. My mother called again. This time she left a voicemail. "They're treating us like criminals," she said, voice shaking. "Is that what you want?" I listened to it once, then deleted it. Want had nothing to do with it anymore. The next surprise came from an unexpected direction. An email from Marissa's former assistant, a woman I barely remembered. Her message was cautious, formal, but the implication was clear. "I have information related to the trust. I'm willing to speak if there are protections in place." Ruth's response was immediate. She set up a call, outlined confidentiality, made sure everything was above board. I listened in silence as the woman spoke. She described instructions Marissa had given her over the years. Request to reroute documents, to delay notifications, to mark certain emails as internal drafts rather than official correspondence. Nothing overtly illegal on its own, but together a pattern. She always said it was for family harmony, the assistant said. That some people didn't need to know everything. Some people, I knew exactly who she meant. Ruth ended the call and sat back. "This changes things," she said. "How?" I asked. "It establishes intent," she replied. "Not just negligence, awareness." Awareness was dangerous. Awareness meant accountability could no longer be framed as misunderstanding. By the end of that week, the trustee issued a preliminary report. Portions of it were sealed, but enough became public to cause ripples. Quiet ones at first. A delayed fundraiser, a postponed gala. Invitations rescinded. People who had always returned my parents' calls suddenly became unavailable. Reputation is a fragile thing. It looks solid until the moment it's not. Daniel finally came to see me then. He showed up at my apartment on a Sunday afternoon, eyes tired, shoulders slumped. "I didn't know," he said, standing awkwardly in my doorway. I studied him for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. "I believe you," I said. And I did. His guilt had always been passive. He benefited, but he hadn't engineered the system. That didn't absolve him, but it explained him. "They're spiraling," he admitted. "Marissa's furious. Mom's panicking. Dad keeps saying this will all blow over." "It won't," I said quietly. He sank onto the couch, rubbing his face. "I don't know what to do." I sat across from him. "You do nothing, or you tell the truth. Those are your options." He looked up at me sharply. "They'll never forgive me if I do." I held his gaze. "They were never protecting you. They were protecting themselves." The words seemed to land. He didn't argue. When he left, I felt something loosen in my chest. Not because he'd chosen a side, but because I had stopped needing him to. The following week, the first formal demand for restitution was filed. Numbers, dates, consequences. It was no longer abstract. It was math. Marissa broke then. She called me late at night, voice sharp with anger and something close to fear. "You think you're winning," she said. "You think this makes you better than us." "No," I replied evenly. "I think it makes me honest." "You always resented me," she snapped. "You couldn't stand that Mom trusted me." I laughed softly, surprising myself. "She didn't trust you. She used you." "There's a difference." She went quiet. "You're destroying everything," she said finally. "I considered that." "No," I said. "I'm letting it collapse under its own weight." She hung up without another word. That night I slept deeply for the first time in months. The truth had momentum now. It no longer needed my energy to move forward. The system was doing what systems do when exposed to light. I thought again of my grandmother, of how she'd watched all of this unfold long before I understood it. How she'd planted a safeguard in the trust, knowing someone someday would need it. She hadn't saved me from the pain. She'd saved me from being erased by it. As I lay awake in the early hours of the morning, one thought settled in with calm certainty. This wasn't revenge in the way people like to imagine it. There was no shouting, no public humiliation staged by me, no dramatic confrontation. This was quieter, more devastating. I hadn't destroyed them. I had simply stepped out of the role that kept them powerful. And without that role, everything they built began to fall apart on its own. The next phase would be the hardest. Because once secrets surface, people don't just lose money. They lose the illusion of who they thought they were. And that loss cuts deeper than anything I could ever say or do. The first article appeared on a Tuesday morning, buried halfway down a business section most people skimmed. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't use words like scandal or fraud. That came later. This one was careful, restrained, almost polite. Local family trust under independent review, following allegations of mismanagement. I read it twice, my coffee untouched beside me. No names were splashed across the headline, but anyone who mattered could read between the lines. Long-standing civic involvement, significant charitable presence, generational wealth. The kind of phrasing reporters use when they know exactly who they're talking about, but are waiting for the second shoe to drop. By noon, my phone started ringing again. This time it wasn't family. It was people who had known my parents for decades, board members, donors, old friends who suddenly wanted clarity, voices tight with concern, curiosity carefully masked as kindness. I didn't answer. Ruth told me later that was the smartest thing I could have done. When people panic, she said they look for reassurance. If you give it to them too early, they'll use it against you. By the end of the week, the second article ran, this one named names. My father's photo appeared beside the text. A younger picture taken during his prime. Confident smile. Tailored suit. The version of him the world respected. The article detailed the trustees' findings so far. Improper transfers. Breach of fiduciary duty. Internal communication suggesting awareness. Marissa's name appeared in the fourth paragraph. I felt a strange detachment reading it, like I was observing someone else's life. The girl who had always been invisible was suddenly nowhere to be found in the narrative. I wasn't framed as a disgruntled daughter. I was simply the party who initiated the review. Neutral, factual, untouchable. That neutrality infuriated them more than accusation ever could have. Marissa showed up at my apartment 2 nights later, pounding on the door like she expected me to hide. When I opened it, she stormed past me, eyes, wild hair pulled back too tightly. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" she demanded. I closed the door calmly. "Yes." "You've humiliated us," she said, pacing my living room. "People are calling. Boards are asking questions. Mom hasn't slept." I watched her carefully. The cracks were visible now. The control she'd always wielded through charm and proximity to power had slipped, and she didn't know who she was without it. "You humiliated yourselves," I said. "I just stopped covering for it." She spun toward me. "You always needed to be the victim." I felt something settle in my chest, not anger, finality. "No," I replied, "I needed the truth. You needed my silence." She laughed sharply. "You think this ends with you winning? They'll never forgive you." "I'm not asking them to." She stared at me, then really stared as if she were finally seeing a version of me she hadn't accounted for. One who wasn't pleading, one who wasn't explaining. Her voice dropped. "You know Dad could face charges." "I know," I said. "And you're fine with that." I held her gaze. "I'm fine with consequences." She stopped pacing. Her shoulders sagged slightly. "They won't survive this," she said almost to herself. I tilted my head. "Neither did I, for a long time." She left without another word. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the city quiet outside my windows. I thought about how often I'd been told to think of the family, to consider how my actions affected others. No one had ever asked how their actions affected me. The next escalation came from an unexpected place. Daniel called. "I spoke to the trustee," he said quietly. I gave a statement. My breath caught. "You did?" "Yes," he replied. "I told him everything I knew. What I was told, what I wasn't." I closed my eyes. "Thank you." "I should have done it sooner," he said. "I didn't want to believe it." "Belief doesn't change facts," I replied gently. His voice broke. "They're furious with me." "I know. I don't think I'm welcome anymore." The old version of me would have rushed to comfort him, to smooth it over, to tell him it would be okay. Instead, I said, "Welcome to the truth." He laughed weakly. "You always were braver than me." "No," I said. "I just ran out of ways to survive quietly." After we hung up, I realized something important. This wasn't just about me anymore. The system that had protected favoritism was collapsing because it depended on compliance. On silence. On people agreeing not to look too closely. Once one person refused, the rest had to choose. Within days, the fallout spread. My parents resigned from 2 boards. A charity quietly removed their names from promotional material. Invitations stopped arriving. Reputation once fractured doesn't shatter all at once. It erodes, slowly, publicly. The trustee's second report was devastating. It confirmed intentional misallocation, recommended restitution, suggested further legal review. Ruth called me after reading it. "They're in serious trouble." I sat down heavily. "What happens next?" She didn't hesitate. "They'll try to negotiate again, or they'll implode." She was right. That evening, my father emailed me. Not called, emailed. The subject line read, "We need to end this." I didn't open it right away. I stared at the screen, thinking about the hallway at the country club. About my name spoken like an inconvenience. About years of being told I was strong enough to go without. They were right about one thing. I was strong enough not to save them from the consequences they'd earned. When I finally opened the email, it was exactly what I expected. Apologies without accountability, offers without truth, a plea disguised as pragmatism. I forwarded it to Ruth without responding. Then I turned off my phone, because the mask had slipped. And once people see what's underneath, they can never unsee it. The next phase wouldn't be about exposure anymore. It would be about reckoning. And reckoning, I had learned, is never quiet. By the time the settlement conference was scheduled, the story no longer belonged to my family. It belonged to the court. That shift was subtle, but profound. For years, everything had been handled behind closed doors, guided by private conversations and unspoken rules. Now there were transcripts, filings, deadlines, a neutral record that did not care about intentions or appearances. The conference was set for a gray Thursday morning in late spring. Mandatory attendance, no press in the room, but no hiding either. Everyone who mattered would be there. I arrived early again, not out of nerves, but habit. Preparation had always been my shield. Ruth joined me with a slim folder and the same calm presence she'd carried since the beginning. "They're going to push hard," she said quietly. "This is their last real chance to control the outcome." I nodded. "What do they want?" "Damage containment," she replied. "Less exposure, less documentation, fewer admissions." "And what do I want?" I asked. She met my eyes. "You want closure on your terms." The room filled slowly. My parents sat together, but the space between them had widened. My mother stared at the table. My father kept adjusting his watch. Marissa arrived last, jaw-tight, eyes hard. Daniel sat off to the side, not quite aligned with anyone. The mediator began with formalities, ground rules, confidentiality, the goal of resolution. Then my parents' attorney spoke. He outlined a new proposal. Larger numbers this time. Full restitution of misallocated funds. An offer to step down permanently from trust involvement. A commitment to repay legal fees. It was generous. It was also incomplete. Ruth listened without interruption, then leaned toward me. "They're still avoiding admission." When it was our turn, she spoke clearly. "My client is not here to negotiate silence," she said. "She is here to resolve a breach of trust in full." The mediator raised an eyebrow. "And what does that entail?" Ruth didn't look at my parents. "Formal acknowledgement of fiduciary violation, independent oversight until restitution is complete, and a written record that reflects what actually occurred." My mother's head snapped up. "That would ruin us," she said, her voice breaking. The mediator held up a hand. "This is not a family discussion. This is a legal one." I watched my parents carefully. The fear was visible now, stripped of polish. They were not afraid of losing money. They were afraid of losing the story they'd told themselves for decades. Marissa leaned forward then. "You want to destroy us?" she said to me directly. I met her gaze. "I want the truth to stand without me holding it up." "That's not truth," she snapped. "That's punishment." I felt something tighten in my chest, then ease. "No," I said. "Punishment would be me deciding your fate. This is consequence." The room went quiet. The mediator cleared his throat. "We need to focus." The back and forth continued for hours. Numbers shifted. Language softened and hardened in turns. My parents' attorney tried repeatedly to frame the issue as family conflict rather than legal breach. Ruth dismantled that framing every time. At one point, my father spoke. He looked at me directly, eyes red, voice hoarse. "What will it take for you to stop?" The question echoed through the room. It was the same one he'd asked months earlier, stripped now of authority. I answered honestly. "For you to stop pretending this was an accident," I said. "And for me to never be asked to protect you again." Silence followed, heavy, unavoidable. The mediator eventually called a break. My parents stepped out with their attorney. Marissa followed, her heels sharp against the floor. Daniel stayed behind. He looked at me, something raw in his expression. "I didn't think it would go this far," he said quietly. "Neither did I replied, "but it needed to." He nodded slowly. "They still think you'll fold." I almost smiled. "They don't know me anymore." When the others returned, something had shifted. The tone was different. Less bargaining, more resignation. They agreed to Ruth's terms. Not eagerly, not gracefully, but fully. The acknowledgement would be written, filed, permanent. As the mediator summarized the agreement, I felt a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying begin to lift. Not relief, something steadier. Completion. When the session ended, my parents stood as if to speak to me. I didn't wait. Outside, the air was warm, the city moving on as if nothing monumental had happened. Ruth walked beside me in silence for a few blocks. "You did this the hard way," she said finally. "The only way that felt honest," I replied. She nodded. "Most people never get that chance." That evening, I sat alone in my apartment windows, open the sound of traffic drifting up from the street. I thought about the younger version of myself, the one who stayed quiet, the one who believed endurance was the same as strength. I wished I could tell her this. That truth has a cost, but silence has a higher one. That revenge isn't about watching others fall apart. It's about refusing to be held together by lies. My phone buzzed once, a message from my mother. "I'm sorry, I should have protected you." I stared at it for a long moment. Then I set the phone down without replying. Because apologies that come after consequences are not for healing, they are for relief. And my healing no longer depended on their understanding. The agreement would be finalized within weeks, public record, permanent. The story they'd tried to bury would live on paper long after the conversations stopped. As night settled in, I realized something else. This wasn't the end. It was the quiet moment before a different beginning. One where my life would no longer orbit the damage they'd caused. One where the truth once told no longer needed me to defend it. And for the first time, I was curious about what came next. Not afraid. Just ready. The paperwork took longer than the confrontation ever had. That was the part no one tells you. Everyone imagines revenge as a single explosive moment, a courtroom gasp, or a public apology. In reality, it's signatures, waiting periods, amended filings, and the slow grind of systems doing exactly what they were designed to do once the truth is no longer hidden. The settlement was finalized in early summer. Ruth called me with the confirmation while I was standing in line for coffee, the barista asking the person ahead of me about oat milk versus almond. "It's done," she said, "filed, recorded, enforceable." I stepped outside, the sun warm on my face, the city alive in that careless way it always is when something inside you has just ended. "Thank you," I said. "You earned it," she replied. "Now comes the part people forget to plan for." "What part?" I asked. "Living," she said. I laughed, a short, surprised sound. I think I forgot how. She didn't laugh back. Most people do. In the weeks that followed, the noise died down. The calls stopped. The emails slowed, then disappeared entirely. The court record became just that, a record, not a conversation. The family narrative, stripped of its private scaffolding, lost momentum without me to push against. My parents sold the second property quietly. My father stepped down from his last board. Marissa withdrew from public view, citing personal reasons. Daniel moved out of state, a clean break that felt necessary for him in a way I didn't resent. I watched all of it from a distance, surprised by how little satisfaction it brought me. Not because it wasn't deserved, but because it wasn't the point. The restitution funds arrived in stages, transferred by a third party under court supervision. Seeing the numbers in my account felt surreal at first. This wasn't a windfall, it was a correction. Years of imbalance slowly leveling out. I paid off my student loans in one quiet afternoon, clicking through confirmations with hands that didn't shake. No ceremony, no announcement, just relief settling deep in my chest. I took a week off work for the first time in years without guilt. No laptop, no checking email in the mornings. I slept late. I walked the city without a destination. I let myself be unproductive in ways that felt almost rebellious. One afternoon, I found myself in a small bookstore I'd passed 100 times but never entered. I picked up a novel my grandmother used to love, the pages yellowed, the spine cracked from use. I sat on the floor between shelves and cried. Not for her absence, for her foresight. She had known I would need this moment even if she couldn't be there to see it. When I returned to work, something had shifted. I was offered a promotion I hadn't pursued. A leadership role that required less proving and more decision-making. I accepted it without the familiar knot of doubt. The work felt different now. I spoke more directly. I set boundaries without apology. When a colleague tried to take credit for something I'd built, I corrected it calmly, publicly, without bracing for backlash. None came. Power, I was learning, is often maintained by the fear of response more than response itself. In August, I received an invitation to a wedding. Not Daniel's, a distant cousin's, one I barely knew. The envelope was formal, cautious, as if unsure whether it should exist at all. I declined, not out of spite, out of clarity. I didn't need to test myself anymore. Instead, I spent that weekend at a lake with friends who knew my story without needing footnotes. We cooked simple meals, swam until our skin wrinkled, talked late into the night about ordinary things. No one asked me how it felt to win. I didn't feel like I had. I felt like I had stopped losing. One evening, sitting on the dock as the sun dipped low, someone asked me if I missed my family. I thought about it carefully before answering. I miss the idea of them, I said. The version where I was protected instead of managed. That answer surprised me with its honesty. Fall came quietly. The city softened. Leaves turned. Life settled into a rhythm that didn't revolve around conflict or anticipation. For the first time, my calendar was full of things I wanted, not things I needed to endure. I started volunteering with an organization that helped adults navigate financial abuse within families. Not as a spokesperson, not as a cautionary tale, just as someone who understood the language of paperwork and silence. One woman older than me by decades held my hand after a session and said I thought it was too late. I shook my head. It's never too late to stop lying to yourself. She smiled through tears. I wish someone had told me that earlier. So do I said. And I meant it. Late one night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I opened the drawer where I'd placed my mother's message months earlier. The apology she'd sent after everything was settled. I read it again. Then I closed the drawer. Forgiveness, I had learned, is not a transaction. It's a decision you make when it serves your peace, not someone else's comfort. As the year drew to a close, I reflected on how much of my life had been shaped by trying not to be difficult, not to upset, not to demand. All that restraint had not made me loved. It had made me convenient. The fight had not turned me into someone else. It had revealed who I'd been all along, buried under years of accommodation. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. And as winter approached, I understood something fundamental. Revenge fades. Truth doesn't. The life I was building now didn't need their absence to define it. It was defined by presence, by choice, by the quiet confidence of knowing I would never again trade my dignity for belonging. That was the real beginning, and I was ready for whatever came next. I thought the silence meant it was over. For months, my life had settled into something steady and unfamiliar. Mornings without dread, evenings without rehearsed conversations. The absence of my family felt less like a wound and more like an old scar, something I noticed only when the weather changed. That's why the knock on my door one Saturday afternoon caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting anyone. No delivery, no plans, just a quiet day and a half-finished book on my coffee table. When I opened the door, my father stood there. He looked thinner, older, not frail but diminished in a way that had nothing to do with age. The man who once filled rooms with his presence now seemed unsure of where to put his hands. "Claire," he said softly, "may I come in?" I hesitated, not because I was afraid, because I was measuring the cost. "Yes," I said, finally stepping aside for a few minutes. He nodded as if he understood the boundary, then walked in slowly, taking in my apartment like it was evidence of a life he'd never bothered to learn. "You've done well," he said, gesturing vaguely. "This place suits you." I didn't respond. Compliments from him had always come with conditions. He sat on the edge of the couch, back straight, hands clasped. I remained standing. "I won't stay long," he said. "I just needed to speak to you privately." I crossed my arms, waiting. He cleared his throat. "Your mother isn't well." I felt the old reflex stir, that instinctive tightening, the pull to prioritize their needs over my own. It flared briefly, then settled. "What does that mean?" I asked. "She's been having panic attacks," he said. "The doctors think it's stress. She doesn't sleep. She barely eats." I watched him carefully. The phrasing was familiar. Concern, yes, but also implication. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said evenly. He nodded as if encouraged. "She asks about you a lot." I didn't answer. "She's struggling with the fallout," he continued. "Losing the boards, the friends, the routines. It's all been destabilizing." I almost smiled. Consequences tend to be. His jaw tightened. "We didn't expect things to go this far." "No," I said quietly. "You expected me to stop them." Silence fell between us. He shifted uncomfortably. "We're not asking for money," he said quickly, "or control, just some kind of reconciliation." There it was, the final door. I walked to the window, giving myself a moment to breathe. Outside, the city moved on without us, indifferent and alive. "What does reconciliation look like to you?" I asked without turning. He hesitated. "Dinner, holidays, being a family again?" I turned back to face him. "And accountability." He looked down. "We've acknowledged mistakes." "You've acknowledged inconvenience," I corrected, "not harm." He stood abruptly. What more do you want from us? The question hung in the air, familiar and exhausted. I don't want anything, I said. That's the difference now. He stared at me, confusion giving way to something like fear. Then why won't you help her? I felt the weight of that question settle in my chest, not as guilt, but as clarity. Because helping her would mean pretending this didn't happen, I said. And I won't do that anymore. His voice broke. She's your mother. And I was her daughter, I replied. For a long time, that didn't seem to matter. He sank back onto the couch, suddenly looking very tired. I failed you, he said quietly. The admission was real. I could hear it in his voice. But it came too late to change anything. Yes, I said, you did. He flinched but didn't argue. I'm not asking you to forgive us, he said, just to soften. I shook my head. Softening is what allowed this to happen. He looked at me, then really looked as if seeing the full shape of me for the first time. Not the convenient daughter. Not the quiet one. The adult woman who had survived without them. I don't recognize you anymore, he said. I felt no urge to defend myself. That's because you never really knew me. The silence that followed was final. He stood slower this time. If you change your mind. I won't, I said gently. He nodded once, accepting what he had already known when he knocked on my door. At the door he paused. She loved you, in her way. I met his eyes. That way wasn't enough. After he left, I closed the door and leaned against it, heart steady, breath even. I waited for the crash of emotion I'd once expected from moments like this. It didn't come. Instead, I felt something settle deeper into place. Boundaries, I realized, are not punishments. They are acknowledgments of reality. That night, I lit a candle and sat in silence, letting the day wash over me. I didn't replay the conversation. I didn't question myself. For the first time, I trusted my own judgment completely. The final door had closed, not with anger, with certainty. And in that certainty, I understood that my life no longer needed their presence to feel complete. I was not cruel. I was finished. The year turned without announcement. No dramatic moment, no final confrontation, no cinematic closure where everyone suddenly understood what they had done. Just winter easing into spring days growing longer, and my life continuing in a way that felt quietly, unmistakably mine. That surprised me more than anything else. For so long I had imagined that the end of this story would feel loud, victorious, like a door slamming shut so hard the echo would follow me forever. Instead, it felt like waking up one morning and realizing the room was finally warm because the draft had been sealed long ago. I didn't think about my family every day anymore. At first, that absence felt strange, almost wrong, as if I were forgetting something important. Then I understood it for what it was, space, the kind that allows other things to grow. Work settled into a rhythm I hadn't known before. I led without shrinking. I spoke without bracing. When decisions were made, my voice carried weight not because I demanded it, but because I trusted it. People noticed, not because I had been wrong before, but because I had finally stopped asking permission to be right. In early summer, I moved to a new apartment. Not out of necessity, but intention. I chose it slowly. Wide windows, morning light, a kitchen that felt like a place to linger rather than escape. I let myself care about where I lived in a way I never had before, as if permanence were no longer something I needed to fear. When friends asked if the move was symbolic, I smiled. Everything is symbolic if you're paying attention. I continued volunteering with the organization that helped adults navigate financial abuse within families. I didn't tell my story unless it served someone else. I listened more than I spoke. I learned how many people had been told they were selfish for wanting fairness, how many had been erased quietly, politely, with smiles and justifications. One woman older than me by decades said something that stayed with me. I always thought karma would fix it, she said. I didn't realize I had to stop participating first. That was it, the whole truth spoken without drama. You don't wait for justice to arrive. You make room for it by stepping out of the lie. In August, Daniel sent me a message. Not an apology. Not a plea, just an update. He had started therapy. He had moved again. He was learning to sit with discomfort instead of avoiding it. I wished him well. And I meant it. I never heard from my mother again. For a while I wondered if I should feel sadder about that, if it meant something was missing in me. Then I realized the opposite was true. What was missing had always been there. I spent Thanksgiving with friends cooking together, laughing over dishes that weren't perfect and didn't need to be. No one assigned blame when something burned. No one kept score. We ate late and talked longer than planned, the night stretching comfortably around us. As we cleaned up, someone raised a glass and said, "I'm grateful for the people who chose me." I held that sentence quietly in my chest. Christmas came and went without tension. No waiting for disappointment, no rehearsing. Just small rituals that felt real because they weren't performed for approval. On New Year's Eve, I stood by my window watching fireworks bloom over the city. I thought about the woman I had been at the beginning of this story, standing in a hallway hearing my name spoken like a mistake, believing that if I stayed quiet long enough, someone would finally choose me. She had survived by disappearing. I had survived by stopping. Revenge. I learned is not the sharp satisfaction people imagine. It doesn't feel like triumph. It doesn't taste sweet. It fades quickly because it was never meant to last. What lasts is dignity. What lasts is waking up without fear. What lasts is knowing that if everything were stripped away tomorrow, you would still recognize yourself. If you've listened to this story and felt something stir, maybe you've lived a version of it yourself. Maybe you were the responsible one, the quiet one, the one told you were strong enough to go without while others were protected. Here's what I want you to hear. You were never too much. You were never difficult. You were never wrong for wanting fairness. And the most powerful form of payback is not proving them wrong. It's building a life where their judgment no longer matters. If this story resonated with you, if it mirrored something you've carried quietly for years, share it in the comments. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, like this video and subscribe for more. Because sometimes the real revenge isn't what you take back. It's what you finally refuse to give away. And that choice changes everything.